네, 그럼 지금부터 세계 평화의 날 기념 원탁 회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 원탁 회의를 진행해 주실 우리 이리나 부코바 사무총장님 소개를 해드릴 텐데요. 이리나 부코바 사무총장님은 전 유네스코 사무총장을 역임하셨고 현재는 우리 경희대학교의 후마니타스 칼리지 명예대학장으로 재직하고 계십니다. 옆에 앉아 계신 분은 학교 법인 경희학원의 조인원 이사장님 함께 자리해 주셨고요. 그 옆에는 로마클럽 회원이신 이안 던랍 회장님께서 함께 자리해 주셨습니다. 그리고 끝에는 우리 캠브리지 대학교의 피터 와담스 교수님 함께 자리해 주셨습니다. 그럼 지금부터 본격적으로 원탁 기념회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이제 마담 부코바께 마이크를 넘겨드리도록 하겠습니다. 마담 부코바, would you please take the mic?
Thank you very much, Dr. Shin. I'm very privileged today to be moderating this, I would say, eminent panel after a day with compelling testimonies, with the, I would say, very strong words we just heard from the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and also after yesterday's discussion, very, I would say, motivating young people who were here in this very hall and putting their questions and expressing their concerns. I listened very carefully, if I may turn now to Professor Cho. I listened very carefully your, I would say, inspiring, knowledgeable, in-depth speech this morning. And I remember also your last year's speech during, once again, this important Peace Bar Festival when, once again, the focus was climate change. And I heard also your appeal. You mentioned some of the inspiring leaders in the last, I would say, 20, 30 years. You mentioned Václav Havel from Eastern Europe, where you quoted him about the responsibility of politicians, of leaders, and in many of the speeches this morning, what transpired was exactly the need for leadership. Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon was very clear on this when he was speaking about leadership, when he shared his own experience during his time as Secretary General of the United Nations. And also, I believe what is very much needed today in a changing world, but world under pressure, and on the first place, of course, the pressure of climate change. So if I may turn first to Professor Cho and ask him the question indeed about the political responsibility, about the climate emergency problems in the world of politics, because I'm more than convinced, something that I said also this morning, that there is enough scientific evidence, but kind of we cannot bridge and pass this scientific evidence to the world of politics. And what, in your view, should be how politicians, this world of politics, is dealing with this emergency situation that we are in today?
네. 우선 그 복구와 총장님께 감사드립니다. 오전에 제가 좀 말씀을 드리려고 했던 내용은 조금 전에 그 복구와 총장님께서 전해주셨듯이 과학적인 그런 증거가 기후 변화에 관한 과학적인 증거가 상당히 그 오랜 기간 누적되어 왔고 거의 모든 그 기후 변화를 연구하는 사이언티스트 과학자들의 컨센서스가 지금 만들어졌습니다. 기후 변화는 좀 매우 심각하고 즉각적인 대응을 요청하고 전 세계가 한 나라, 한 사회, 한 시민이 아니라 전 세계가 이를 긴급 사태로 규정하고 또 우리의 실존적인 그런 위협의 문제로 생각하고 즉시 대응해야 한다라고 하는 점에는 많은 과학자들이 그 공감을 하고 있는 것 같습니다. 그리고 특히 그 최근에 쏟아져 나오는 그 연구 결과가 저는 비전문가로서 좀 살펴봤더니 특히 그 최근에는 그 엄중한 상황이 더 나날이 매우 빠른 속도로 증가하는 것 같습니다. 얼마 전에 이 자리에 계신 그 이안 던럽 선생님이 그 집필하신 그 보고서를 읽을 기회가 있었습니다. 오전에도 잠깐 언급을 했습니다만 아까 그 Paris Climate Accord에 관한 파리 기후 협약에 관해서 금세기 말까지 1.5도씨로 제한해 보자. 산업화 시기 이전에 비해서. 그리고 혹시 불가능할 경우에는 well below 2 degrees Celsius라고 하는, 그러니까 2도씨 훨씬 못 미치는 그런 단계까지 막아보자 하는 그런 preach, 그러니까 그 약속이 되겠죠. 그것이 잘 지켜지지 않을 뿐더러 아까 나왔던 미행 정부의 어떤 그 탈퇴 선언 이후의 움직임, 또 많은 나라들이 거기에 동참한다라는 표현이 좀 어폐가 있을 것 같지만 좀 매우 미온적인 태도를 보이고 있는 상황입니다. 더 문제를 심각하게 하는 것은 지금 순간도 그 CO2 배출 누적량이 매우 빠른 속도로 증가하고 있는데 IPCC 리포트 지난 10월 리포트가 하는 이야기는 우리가 현상 유지를 할 경우에 비즈니스 에즈 유저이죠. 그러면 제 기억으로는 아마 혹시 좀 틀리면 우리 이안 던럽 선생님께서 지적을 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 2040년으로 기억을 하고 있습니다. 우리가 현상 유지, 스테이터스 코어를 유지할 경우에는 2040년경에 아마도 2도씨를 지금보다 한 1도 정도 더 올라가는 그런 상태가 초래될 수 있다. 근데 최근의 연구 결과는 던럽 선생님의 그 리포트를 포함해서 40년이 아니라 2030년에 그것을 넘어설 가능성도 있다, 이런 연구들이 나오는 것 같습니다. 30년이면 불과 이제 10년 정도 남은 상태인데 비즈니스 as usual이 아니라 훨씬 더 CO2가 증가하고 있다면 상황은 더 엄중할 수 있다라는 그런 상황입니다. 그 문제를 보면서 저는 기후학자가 아니기 때문에 이것을 아침에는 이제 세상의 정치라는 표현을 사용을 했는데 현실 정치가 이런 문제를 다 아는 상황에서 왜 이렇게 적극적인 대응을 못하느냐. 과거에는 정치가 우리 세상을 이끌고 또 사회는 쫓아가고, 그래서 사실 많은 정계에 있는 분들 우리가 리더라고 얘기를 합니다. 근데 그 최근에는 그런 모습이 전혀 보이지 않는 정치를 우리는 뭐라고 불러야 할 것이냐. 상당히 좋은 말로는 섬김의 리더십이라고 얘기를 합니다. 섬김의 리더십. 근데 정말 섬기는지는 잘 모르겠고요. 결국은 어떤 세상의 문제를 제일 많이 그 정보를 가지고 있음에도 불구하고 움직이지 않는 정부, 정치를 어떻게 볼 것이냐. 이 부분은 시민들의 몫이라고 생각이 됩니다. 그래서 아까 우리가 이 기후 온난화와 관련된 수많은 그런 어떤 재앙적인 현상, 지금 현재 이 시간에도 벌어지고 있는 재앙적인 현실에 관해서 많이 얘기를 나눴는데요. 굉장히 충격적이었던 것은 불과 한 달, 제 기억으로 한 4주, 5주, 3주, 4주 남짓한 기간 동안에 북극의 수백 회의 거대한 그런 화염에 휩싸인 곳들이 우주에서 찍은 사진을 받고 우리 신문에도 보도가 됐습니다. 상당히 화재는 언제나 있는 것이지만 굉장히 그 전례 없는 빈도와 규모로 일어나고 있다라는 뉴스가 나왔고요. 그다음에는 중앙 아프리카 지역에 지금 아마존에서 불이 나고 있는데 훨씬 넓은 지역에서 제 기억으로는 한 4천, 5천 회에 달하는 화재가 일어났다고 합니다. 이 남아시아, 서남아시아 그 열대우림에서도 마찬가지고, 이번에 봤던 충격적인 아마존의 그 사건이죠. 말 그대로 사건인데 우리 열대우림이 없어지는 이런 처참한 광경을 우리가 지금 경험을 하고 있는데 정치권에서는 얼마나 여기에 관해서 심각하게 생각하고 있는가. 만약에 정치가 그것을 심각하게 생각하지 않는다면 우리 시민들이 알려고 하는 노력이 매우 중요하다고 생각합니다. 알고 정보와 지식을 공유하고 우리가 매일매일 일상을 얘기하듯이 이런 매일매일 지구에서 벌어지는 일들을 가족과 친지와 동료와 이야기를 나누면서 이 심각성을 생각해보고 어떤 의견을 교환하는 것이 굉장히 중요하지 않겠냐. 제가 너무 길게 답을 한 것 같은데 한 가지만 말씀을 드리고 마치도록 하겠습니다. 제가 대학원 때 공부를 할 때 저는 정치학, 정치사회학, 정치경제학 이런 쪽에 공부를 했습니다. 그런 가운데 읽은 책 중에 하나가 아주 방대한 막스 웨버의 그 유고 글을 이제 실은 방대한 양의 책인데 제가 그게 다 읽었다는 얘기는 아니고 그 중에서 읽은 부분 중에서 생각나는 구절이 있습니다. 그러니까 이런 얘기를 합니다. 역사의 흐름은 기본적으로 이해관계에 의해서 떠밀려 간다. 우리 세상을 보면 굉장히 맞는 것 같죠. 그런데 아주 종종 매우 드물게 아이디어, 그러니까 관념에 의해서 세상이 변하기도 한다. 마치 전철수의 역할을 하고 있는 것 같은 전철수는 그 기차의 회로를 바꾸는 스위치맨을 얘기를 하는 거죠. 전철수의 역할을 하고 하는 어떤 그 관념에 의해서 아이디어를 관념으로 표현해야 될지 모르겠지만 하여튼 관념에 의해서 세상이 종종 매우 드물게 변하기도 한다. 만약에 그것이 역사의 기제라면, 역사 어떤 저 흐름의 기제라면 그것이 지금 절실히 필요한 시점이 아닌가. 근데 그 기제를 전철수의 역할을 누가 할 것이냐? 과거의 리더십을 가진 정치였다면 정치가 할 수도 있겠지만 이제는 그 시대가 지나간 것 같습니다. 여러 가지 이유로 바로 우리 개개인이 시민들이 해야 하지 않을까 하는 생각을 합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Cho. I think you mentioned something very important. You spoke about the politics of truth, something that is very much needed today, and particularly when we speak about climate change, but not only, if I may. And also, you spoke about the power of ideas. You ended with the power of ideas, and it just reminded me about what the famous French author and humanist Victor Hugo said, that there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I think maybe, as you rightfully said, this is about our action for climate change that we have to take as a very powerful idea. But speaking about the world of politics, I think you rightfully said that if politicians are not living up to what is the pressing need of the day, then people should act, society, civil society groups and others should act, and we have seen a lot of mobilization around it. But I kind of go back to the very fundamentals of democracy, of representative democracy, and whether we should need to strengthen it, we should need to look at whether we are failing with it in order to look at from the point of view of responsibilities towards saving the planet and climate change. And I probably would like to move to Dr. Dunlop. Ian, if you could follow a little bit on that. Are the representative democracy failing us, this system? Do you think that, once again, politicians are living up, to follow a little bit of what Professor Cho said? Because it needs, indeed, a discussion in order to have the right answers.
Yeah, look, I think this is very important. I don't think we actually have representative democracy any longer. if you go back and look at history since World War II, the development of the sort of capitalist economic model has been critical around the world in delivering a tremendous amount of wealth and improved living standards and so on. But what has happened, I think, particularly in the last 20 years, is that as we've moved before that from a period where nations were being rebuilt or nations were expanding in the case of Korea and developing, the dominance of the more extreme capitalism has spread right around the world. And even though it may not be quite as evident in Asia, the drivers of that still effectively drive the economy. In other words, short-term economic performance, individual rewards have become more and more dominant in the way we actually operate. What that has done in the Western democracies is to deliver a tremendous amount of power to the dominant organizations economically, and particularly to the fossil fuel industry, because in the end, economies operate on energy. They don't operate on money. If you don't have energy, nothing happens, which has meant that the oil and coal and gas companies in the world have tremendous political influence, and certainly far too much influence in countries where they dominate, like Australia, the United States, Canada. And I think the same sort of short-termism issues have permeated pretty much the rest of the world, even where you have authoritarian regimes such as China, for example, and elsewhere. The problem with that is that it means that democracy in the true sense of the word has gradually been worn away over time, to the point where the interests of those powerful corporate actors have tended to dominate. And political activity has very much followed corporate preferences over the last particularly 15 years. And in some countries, particularly where the reward system for individuals in the corporate sector is now based on bonuses which reflect very short-term performance, that's become an almost paranoid obsession of making sure that you get that short-term outcome. Now, the result of that has meant that any long-term issue, such as climate change in the way it used to be 20 years ago, it's no longer a long-term issue, it's now a very short-term issue. But it's meant that climate change didn't get any real attention. And so what we've seen is that in most countries, even though we have a few leaders around the world who are prepared to speak out on it, in most countries, politicians have not seen it as an important issue. It's been an environmental matter which is out here somewhere on the side, but the really important stuff is to keep the economy growing, to keep employment levels up, and in particular, not to rock the status quo of the capitalist framework. Now, the problem we're now into is that the implications of continuing use of resources in a finite planet where you're using them up, and by resources I mean having an atmosphere into which to pump carbon pollution, we no longer have flexibility to do that. We cannot any longer keep emitting waste products from the use of fossil fuels, for example. And therefore, the fundamentals of the capitalist economy are now under attack because it isn't sustainable. So democracy has failed us, I think, in that sense, and what we're about now is a complete need to reinvent democracy onto some rational and sensible basis. The difficulty we're in is that the political system is locked in to the short-termist position, and it's my view that it is incapable of actually addressing the types of challenge we now face with climate change. It's going to require something to really force the issue, and that something is basically all of you. Because if the community don't start responding and demanding action at all levels, whether it be older people, middle-aged, younger people, but action as individual citizens, then we're not going to solve this, because the political system has to be forced to confront the reality we now face. It may be that we have to put in place, as in wartime, a different structure, which basically says, look, there is this one problem out there that is bigger than anything else. We now have to bring, as I said in the talk, all of the resources to bear to solve that. And at least in the immediate future, that may mean we can't operate in a democratic system. Now, I think whether that occurs or not will very much depend on the position of individual nations and the way that their communities and their politicians respond. But you are seeing fragmentation in all directions within a country like the United States, as I think Ban Ki-moon mentioned. I mean, whilst you have President Trump in complete climate denial and doing everything possible to make sure that he makes it far worse, the states in the US are taking a very different view. So you're having that sort of breakup. The same sort of thing is tending to happen in Australia. And you can see, similar events around the world. But the critical position now is to start in every country to rethink whether we actually have a system that is capable of responding to this sort of challenge. And if it's not, then what are we going to do about it in terms of emergency action? So I think in a country like Korea, where I understand that climate change is not high priority amongst the political and corporate incumbency, then it's very much, it seems to me, a matter for the community in Korea to start making or start becoming very unreasonable. I mean, you have to start making your voice heard that, look, this is absolutely critical. We're a major contributor to the problem. And we have to bring this to the attention of leadership. And if the leadership isn't prepared to pay attention, it has to be changed. Now, that may sound sort of revolutionary, but that is what we're talking about. That's what an emergency actually means. I could spend a bit more time on this, but perhaps I'll leave it at that at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dunlop. You mentioned so many interesting things indeed, many points. I will just pick a few of them because I think this is very important. It is about reinventing democracy from the point of view of a real agenda, democratic agenda for the whole of society, which of course embraces climate change as an emergency, as something that really needs to be tackled today. You mentioned, of course, about the wartime approach. I guess this is exactly what is needed nowadays because climate change is every single day presenting to us its challenges and accelerating its course. You mentioned something very important, I believe, that kind of we do not put together so often. You mentioned about the sustainability. I think the word sustainability should be present in all our discussions about economic models, about social development, about tackling climate change. And unfortunately, I see after 2015, when the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goal, and it is not by chance that in the Agenda 2030 there is goal number 13, which is about climate change. And then, of course, a few months later, 2 months later, it adopted the the Paris Climate Agreement. So the two of them are part and parcel of the same agenda. So I think nowadays nobody can say that climate change or sustainable development should not be abiding by respecting climate change I would say, targets and goals, and vice versa. I think this is extremely, extremely important. So I think the key in all these policy decisions is, in fact, sustainability. So there is no excuse for politicians and for governments. And also you mentioned the fragmentation. I think it is one of the problems of the governance of these processes is the fragmentation because the climate change do not know political borders and geographical borders. It's a common challenge. And how you govern the governance of this in the situation where multilateralism is under threat, as Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Professor Cho mentioned in their presentations, it puts a lot more challenges on this issue. But if I, before going to Professor Peter Wadhams, maybe I could ask Professor Cho. Dr. Dunlop mentioned about the Korean society and mentioned also the climate change concerns, whether they're high or not very high on the Korean society. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how to tackle this problem. I think, if you allow me, Korea has been with a lot of solidarity with the developing world, including on some of the mitigation and adaptation issues when it comes to development programs. And it is a bit strange to see that it is not very high on the political agenda of your country.
제가 숫자를 좀 잘 기억 못해서 항상 제가 말씀드리는 통계나 숫자는 좀 틀릴 수 있다라는 것을 전제로 하겠습니다. 아마 우리나라가 최근 통계에 의하면 그 탄소, 특히 그 이산화탄소 대기 중 배출 총량이 9위, 세계 9위 아니면 10위인 것 같습니다. 퍼 캐피타로 하면 그 1인당 배출량으로 하면 그보다 조금 더 아래인 것 같습니다. 그러니까 아마 전 세계 거의 200여 국가가 있는데 매우 사실 그 높은 탄소를 매일매일 배출하고 있습니다. 우리나라의 국민적 관심은 요즘은 좀 많이 좋아졌죠. 그 미세먼지에 좀 많은 관심을 가지고 있고, 또 아까 우리 반기문 총장님께서도 미세먼지 해결을 위한 정확한 명칭이 기후환경 국가회의인가요? 를 특별 카운슬을 만들어서 이렇게 활동을 하고 계시고, 과거보다는 좀 호전된 것 같습니다. 근데 우리가 우리들의 경제 활동에 의해서 또 산업 활동에 의해서 앞서 말씀드린 대로 어떤 이 컨버션이죠. 연소를 하게 되면 화석 연료를 석탄이 됐든 또는 가스가 됐든 오일이 됐든 연소를 하면 여러 가지 물질들이, 화학 물질들이 나오는데, 그 중에서 지금 과학계가 주목하고 있는 것은 이산화탄소, 메탄과 가스죠. 나머지는 대부분 저도 잘 모르는 수십, 수백 가지의 화학 물질이 대기 중에 머문다고 합니다. 근데 아까 온실가스는 주로 이제 CO2, 메탄 가스를 얘기를 하는데, 그 밖에 메탄가스는 우리가 직접 보고 또 건강에 해롭다라는 것을 우리가 너무도 잘 알고 있기 때문에 국가적으로도 관심을 많이 갖는데, 그린하우스 가스는 우리가 눈에 보이는 것이 아니고 하기 때문에, 또 온난화라고 하는 것은 세대마다 차이가 있을 것 같습니다. 제가 얼마 전에 그걸 확인을 했더니 제가 어떤 이유에서 1961년 통계를 잘 기억하고 있습니다. 1961년은 5.16이 일어났던 그 해이죠. 그때 당시 대한민국의 퍼캐피타가 80불이었습니다. 아마 젊은 세대들은 잘 이해를 못하실 텐데 1인당 국민소득이 80불, 세계 최빈 국가였습니다. 그런 상황 속에서 오늘 우리가 이런 산업화를 이루었고 큰 경제 발전을 이루었는데, 그 과정 속에서 우리가 알게 모르게 젖어든 문화화가 있고 만들어온 역사적인 관성이 있습니다. 그것은 성장, 경제 성장, 또 모든 성공의 가치가 경제와 성장에 맞춰지는 이런 문화 속에서 우리는 살아왔고 당연하다라고 생각을 했고 또 한편으로는 그래서 이만큼 우리나라의 어떤 경제 수준이 올라왔다라고 하는 자부심도 있지만 또 다른 편에 우리가 우리 근대화 모델의 그 그늘질 측면에 대해서 깊이 생각을 못했던 것이 아닌가. 물론 그 과정 속에서 어떤 그런 inequality라든지 이런 민주화라고 하는 그런 큰 성취, 어찌 보면 좀 상당히 위대한 성취를 이뤘죠. 그러나 어떤 환경 문제라든지 이런 공해 문제라든지 이런 기후 문제라는 문제는 사실은 먹고 사는 문제보다도 더 중요할 수도 있습니다. 우리의 생존이 걸려 있는 문제고 우리의 생존뿐만 아니라 지구적인 차원에서 매우 실존적인 위협의 상태를 만들어내고 있고 또 우리가 그런 산업화를 하는 과정에 뭐 우리나라뿐만이 아니죠. 그 유럽에서 산업혁명이 시작된 이래로 성공한 나라, 또 그렇지 않은 나라. 아까 우리가 61년도 최빈국이라고 얘기를 했었는데 그런 인컴 레벨에 있는 나라들이 아직 지구상에는 존재하죠. 또 좀 그보다 상황 좋지만 매우 삶의 조건이 열악한 나라들이 수없이 지구상에는 많습니다. 근데 그 기후변화, 탄소 배출에 의한 인위적인 기후변화의 그 결과는 우리한테도 대단히 큰 실존적인 문제지만 개도국에서는 오늘 내일 죽고 사느냐의 문제로 굉장히 험악한 기후 현실을 만들어내고 있습니다. 그래서 그 부분을 우리가 대한민국이 어떤 산업화의 정당성을 말하고 국가 발전의 정당성을 말하기 위해서는 꼭 풀어야 할 문제가 아닌가라는 생각이 들고 어떤 우리의 생존을 위해서나 또는 지금 어떤 우리보다 경제 상황이 안 좋은 나라 사람들의 생명을 권리를 우리가 함께 지켜나갈 수 있게끔 그런 책임 있는 그런 자세를 취해야 하는 게 우리 대한민국의 현 주소가 아닌가 하는 생각을 합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Cho. You reminded something very important that also Dr. Dunlop mentioned about the economic model and giving the example of Korea. Before going to the science, if you'll just allow me one small remark, which I think is very important, transpired from your intervention. If somewhere in the 60s, the 70s, when the environmental concerns started to emerge, and I'm thinking about the first sustainability report of the United Nations, the so-called Brundtland report, when the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, put this report, there was the concern about environment. It was more into the environmental area, and the Club of Rome, of course, where Dr. Dunlop is also an eminent member, took it and developed it further. But there was considered to be a concern of the urban middle classes, of the urban elites, and probably that is why it was not entirely embraced by the developing countries, who consider that they have to choose the model, as you said, of growth, of fossil fuel growth, of the industrial growth, the way the other countries have done it. And now we see that this model is not sustainable, once again sustainable, and that they have to make these shortcuts, as we say, in order not to repeat it, but to move also technologically and to improve their way of living, but on an entirely different model. It is not easy to do it politically, but this is once again where political leadership is very important. And the argument for that also is that climate change affects mostly the poor of the poorest. When look at the slums in the urban development and the cities, who is affected when there is flood or a typhoon or some kind of a natural disaster? It is the slums, it is the poor in the megacities, or in countries, developing countries which lack infrastructure. Even in developed country, I remember about Katarina in New Orleans. It was really those who are the poor who are affected. So I think if we change the optics on the understanding about climate change, we will have additional argument also for everybody to come on board when it comes to tackling and all these measures. But if we stay still in the world of politics, but enlarge it a little bit, and I would like to turn to Peter Adams, I think scientists play a hugely important role in this, and actually this is how it all started, with the evidence, with the truth, I would say, the scientific truth that is coming, transpiring of so many research papers and advocacy, I would say, on behalf of the scientists, which is so much needed nowadays. The question here is whether politicians listen to you, whether you think that this necessary interface between science and policy is there, whether there is a bridge and that these politicians, these leaders, are taking informed decisions based on your science, this hard truth that you just presented to us as well.
There are cases where the link or the jump between scientists and politicians has been very rapid. For instance, Margaret Thatcher, was British Prime Minister, very quickly got involved with the problem of climate change and doing something about it, under the influence of Sir John Houghton, who was the Director General of the Meteorological Office and later one of the leaders of the first stages of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So he talked to her about climate change. She understood what he was talking about because she was trained as a chemist. So you had a leap from a scientist to a politician, and it resulted in action, or at least the beginnings of action. So that can happen, but it seldom happens, certainly in British politics, because of the ignorance of politicians about science. So the education process is a long, slow, painful one to get understanding out of politicians. Some aspects of how those links work or don't work, I think, and some of them have been discussed earlier. One is it what kind of democratic system allows climate change issues to be discussed and then dealt with? And the Chinese model clearly is not a democratic system that can do this, because it's not a democratic system. But there's a case where decisions are made supposedly in the interests of dealing with climate change, but in fact in the interests of the ruling, I suppose ruling class is the word, or ruling group, so that China has been allowed to get away with stating that it's going to start reducing carbon emissions in 2030, which is far too late. And also, China is offending in other ways, which don't get discussed because there isn't any free discussion. One of those, for instance, is production of cement. Now, cement is the most antisocial material in the world because of not only do you use a lot of energy to produce the cement, but the production of cement involves a chemical reaction which itself produces carbon dioxide. So cement is in terms of greenhouse gases produced per unit mass of cement, it's the worst substance in the world. You shouldn't build buildings out of cement, so you shouldn't have concrete buildings. Yet when you go to a Chinese city, you go to Beijing, there are countless thousands of concrete apartment blocks and concrete office blocks. Everything is made out of concrete, and one of the reasons is that China has a state monopoly of cement production, so that the bureaucrats who endlessly expand the cement industry gain from that, and except that it's harmful for the environment. So extremely harmful things, still opening coal-fired power stations, increasing cement production and not switching to other means of other materials with which we could build our buildings. Those are the products of a society in which nothing is discussed, but decisions are made purely on the basis of benefiting the ruling group. So a democratic system offers in principle a much better way of being able to make decisions about doing something about climate change. As we see, as Ian has said, there are many cases where representative democracy doesn't work very well, and the ways in which it does work, when we think about political leaders who are able to lead or involve the people in decision making on climate change that works, we unfortunately have to look at smaller countries or small regions rather than large countries. For instance, my colleague in Cambridge, Sir David King, has been involved with being the advisor to the government of Rwanda for development and climate change work. Now, you think of Rwanda as a kind of terrible basket case of a country. It's very poor. It was involved in, suffered from massacres not that long ago. But apparently it's now well on the way towards being a country that's actually self-sufficient in renewable energy. And so something is being done there in a country that's fairly small. If we go to Britain, we have to go to an even smaller unit to find a community that really is working in climate change work. And I'm thinking of the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland, where I often go for their annual science festival. And there's a set of islands with wonderful fast tidal streams between the islands, which are being tapped with current turbines. They've got enormous amounts of wind because it's a very windy place, and they've got an enormous amount of waves, and so there's a development program on wave generating systems. So taking it all together, that Orkney is actually self-sufficient in renewable energy, and and yet it's an advanced country. It's an advanced part of the Western world, and yet it's managing, because of its special position with respect to the natural resources that are needed for renewable energy production, to be taking a leading position. And it's people are coming from other countries to learn how to do things from Orkney. And in fact, a recent film by Leonardo DiCaprio called Ice on Fire, a lot of it was shot in Orkney. So we do have units of community that are small enough to really work in terms of dealing with climate change within themselves, for making themselves free of fossil energy. But they tend not to be big ones. I mean, I can't think of another country besides Rwanda which is doing a very good job. So therefore we have to go, firstly we have to stay in the democratic system so that at least everything is openly discussed, but we have to move to beyond the country unit for the science to be enacted properly. We have to go and look on the worldwide scale, because we do need something, the sort of thing that's been mentioned, a military program. I used to advocate something like the Manhattan Project, that if you realize that something is absolutely vital above all else, you'll put a huge amount of resources into it and get it done. I think I was wrong about the Manhattan Project because that was done in complete secrecy. So what we're looking at here is open discussion amongst scientists and amongst the public. So we shouldn't be thinking maybe more of the Marshall Plan, or another parallel might be the Apollo Moon Project. Huge resources are devoted to a worthy end where there's completely open discussion about how something should be done. So that end, which is how do we beat climate change, is one which transcends, I think, any one country, and it transcends any one scientist, but it doesn't transcend all the climate scientists put together who do have views through organisations like IPCC, but also through their own achievements in bringing about elements of the change that's needed. So I'm thinking, for instance, of this recent inspection trip I did of facilities for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by direct air capture. The people doing that tend to be quite young and very enthusiastic, and not only full of energy, but full of ingenuity, and they're thinking of new ways of taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and doing something with it that's going to be useful and possibly profitable. And all they need is support. So what you need if you're confronting yourself with a problem, a global problem, which is how do we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to save ourselves from future climate change, and at the same time get rid of it effectively and cost effectively. That's a giant problem, and it's probably, in my view, it's the biggest problem facing the human race. But it can be broken down and attacked in different ways by scientific groups who have particular expertise working together or working separately to try to develop and improve methods. So for that, there needs to be strong scientific financial support for them. They shouldn't be sort of messing around with working in their backyards with tiny amounts of money, which is what they do at the moment. Every one of these groups is operating on a shoestring. There should be an international program which has a lot of money available to it and is able to put money into sufficient money into promising systems that simply require further development and can then be installed as a way to actually save us from climate change. It is partly science, but it's also engineering, because the science is pretty much understood. It's how do you implement that science in an effective way via engineering systems that need to be installed in the world in sufficient numbers to actually deal with the problem, in this case the problem of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Therefore, I would recommend something beyond a country. It works on a small scale if you've got a community that's less than a country, like Orkney, but you have to flip the national scale and go to the international scale, I think, to really accomplish worldwide change. Because on a national scale, you're going to be subject to national politicians and who are often not very good at seeing beyond immediate needs. So some kind of international organisation, because we have plenty of international organisations, certainly with the UN, but they don't have billions of dollars to throw around, and they are going to need billions. So we have to have an organisation which can bring together scientists and public discussion of how the public would like to see climate change tackled, and the scientists saying how and engineers saying how it can be done, and then some enlightened international body responding to all that and putting the money in that's needed. So I think scientists have already done the work, had their say. We know what needs to be done. We know and we certainly know now through modelling and observation how fast things are going if we don't do anything. And I suppose that's an area of science which is very important, because every change that's going on at the moment without anything being done seems to be an exponential change, which means you look behind you on an exponential and everything's flat, nothing's gone wrong yet. You look in front of you and you're climbing a cliff. So there's going to be, if we don't take serious action, there'll be changes which we're already documenting, and you can see where they're going to lead. So scientists can warn where things are going to go if we don't take any action. But scientists can also advise where to go, and will happily accept large quantities of money to take us there because of the investments needed in, say, carbon removal systems.
Thank you very much, Professor Widom, for these interesting presentations with a lot of points there. I think what you mentioned about the scientific approach, but not only about the overall societal and democratic process, is extremely important. I was asking myself the question of we speak about the urgency, we speak about reaching some tipping points in all this, we speak about wartime mobilization, and it seems in this area that on one side we see kind of a generational divides that are emerging within societies. On the other side, there is an incremental or a gradual approach, which we should not deny, that more and more people, more and more entities, businesses also, are trying to adapt, but it seems it's very slow. And my question towards Dr. Dunlop, because he has been with the Club of Rome in 1972, when you published and you mentioned in your speech yesterday the limits of growth. Now you just spoke about the new type of model. Do you think that we are on track with the transition to low carbon economy? Because we speak a lot about this transition to low carbon economy. How is the private sector and I would say overall economy moving? Is this the right approach where we gradually try to adapt, or we really have to do something differently?
Oh, look, I think it's absolutely crystal clear that the time for a gradual approach disappeared 10 years ago. We now have to have an emergency approach to doing this as fast as we possibly can. I mean, that's what the science is basically telling us. I mean, we're not on track to make the appropriate transition. There's a lot of discussion about the fact what I think you're seeing around the world is gradually companies are now coming to accept that climate change is real, whether in America or in Australia and I think in Asia as well. But they still have the idea that this gradual transformation, incremental change, is actually possible, which it's not. I mean, that's what Peter is really telling us. So that fundamentally has to be speeded up. And I think the one thing that is starting to happen is that the people providing the money, for various reasons, are accepting that the risks that we now face by not making an emergency transition are actually bigger in terms of financial markets than anything that we're going to experience in the financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008. Now, the regulators around the world are running up the flag and saying, look, if we don't move on this, we're in for a major world financial crisis. The work on that has been led by the Bank of England, by Mark Carney, and they have put in place a task force led by Michael Bloomberg, used to be the mayor of New York, that came up with recommendations saying every company listed on a stock exchange around the world should now disclose to the investors what the risk of climate change is going to be to that particular company. So investors know, if they're putting the money into things, what their exposure to climate risk actually is. Now, this has been very valuable in confronting companies with the reality that you now have to look at climate change as an absolutely serious issue. And it's made boards of directors, for example, sit up and pay attention. Also the fact that they, under many legislations around the world, are now legally liable for not looking at that risk if they continue on business as usual. So we're beginning to see that sort of change occur. But so far this is very much reactive. I mean, people are saying, well, if somebody like the government put up rules to say we're going to a 2°C world, then what would be the impact on my company? But that's not really the question that has to be asked. The real question those companies have to be asked is, what are you going to do as a company to contribute to creating a 2°C or less world? And that's a different question entirely. Because what that means is that for oil and gas companies or coal companies or things of that kind, they are going to have to write off the assets that are in their balance sheet because they won't be able to produce them. They won't be able to produce all of those coal reserves or oil reserves and so on. And that confronts them with a big dilemma, because to do that, it means that the share price will drop. It means for a lot of them the remuneration, the reward they get will be smaller. And so people are very nervous about doing it. But the fact is that that's what we are now confronted with. And I think the one thing that's going to drive this is the dawning realization by major corporations that unless they start to address climate change, they will not have a future. Their markets are going to disappear. I mean, under a 3°C world, global markets will collapse in the conventional sense. So you won't be able to sell your coal or gas or whatever. So it's now in your own interests to actually accept the reality and start to act accordingly, which in their terms will certainly be an emergency. So that investment dimension is one of the biggest drivers in forcing the pace of change right at the moment. I don't know how many companies in Korea have started to get into that, but that is one thing that could be encouraged in a global context to make Korean organizations face up to the reality we're now having to address it.
Yes, thank you very much. I think now our time is approaching the end. It's a fascinating discussion, but I would like to ask each of you, we are here at an academic institution, university. We spoke today and yesterday about the need for education. We see this divide between generations. And I would like to ask you, on one side, what you think is the role of university, what you think is the role of education at the different level, and also what you would like to pass as a message to the younger generation. We have here many young people, students, faculty also, high school students, and I think they will be very interested to listen to. Maybe I will start with you, Peter.
Thanks. Well, obviously, more education, much more is needed. I mean, for instance, I teach a course on climate change, a master's course at 2 different Italian universities at the moment, and the hunger for learning about climate change processes and how they happen, what can we do about them, is very strong amongst European students, certainly Italian students, and I think that, and it's got stronger because I think we're finding young people who are still at school, people who are doing degrees. There should be at school everybody should have a basic education on climate change and what's happening to the world and how the climate works, why are things changing, what is it, what's the whole business about, so that they appreciate this when they leave school. That will then encourage them to study courses which will lead them to possible jobs in that industry, in the increasing numbers of industries that are developing based on renewable energy, and they will be able to be involved from a position of knowledge. And at the moment, people are having to pick this thing up just by reading books, or they're not that there aren't regular courses on climate change being taught in very many places. There are some, but it needs to be taught everywhere as a standard subject, as a very large part of say a geography course or a meteorology course. It has to be something that every child learns about, and then has a chance to go further with that, and that's where we'll get the people who can make those changes and aren't stuck in the thinking of the past era, which is now coming to an end pretty rapidly. So it's schools and universities, I think, are vital here. So this university could be
Thank you very much, Peter. Ian?
Well, it seems to me that one of the key roles of the university is to look to the future. I mean, what are going to be the big issues that you have to address? How do you prepare students for the future, to the world they're going to inhabit? To me, there is absolutely nothing more important at the moment than a university accepting what the science is saying, the sort of things Peter has outlined, accepting that this is an immediate existential threat to the future of your student communities, and being prepared to articulate and train people in why that is the case and what we can do about it, and particularly on the solutions, because we have the solutions. And we have what is in fact an enormous opportunity to now make this transition to a low-carbon world. But the critical thing, somebody said yesterday, yeah, but education's fine, but it takes too long. Well, that is a concern. So I think there really has to be an effort on the part of the university to get the concept of urgency across, to do everything possible to disseminate the knowledge of the emergency we face, and then start to demand of your governments and get your information into the community, so they start demanding that you can now take advantage of this opportunity, and we should see it not as a disaster, but actually as an opportunity. But to do that, you've got to start from the fact that it is an extremely serious threat. Otherwise, you're not going to get the attention. So I think we need a different storyline about what climate change means, and it can come from the university sector if other people are not acting. And hopefully then you will get corporations and politicians starting to join in recognizing that that is the chance they now have to become leaders in that context. So, in other words, the bottom line, I think, is that university people have to become very unreasonable in insisting that this is the picture that people start to confront and pick up on.
Thank you very much, Ian. Dr. Cho?
대학 뿐만 아니라 이제 우리 교육기관이 어떻게 앞으로 방향 설정해야 할 것이냐 하는 문제는 매우 참 중요한 문제인 것 같습니다. 특히 그 미래 세대의 그 앞날을 놓고 봤을 때, 비춰봤을 때 모든 대학에 또 교육기관에 종사하는 모든 사람들이 정말 그 책임 의식을 가지고 깊이 고민해야 할 과제가 아닌가 합니다. 그러니까 어떤 한 철학자의 말처럼 지금 우리 이 사회 기성세대의 그 몫은 그 미래 세대의 그 온전한 삶의 조건을 물려주는 것이 만약에 우리의 윤리적인 책임이다 라는 그런 명제를 생각한다면 우리가 당면한 현실과 도래할 미래가 어떤 모습을 띠고 있느냐 하는 것을 있는 그대로 현실 그대로 알려주는 그런 솔직함, 진정성이 어떤 교육기관의 가장 근본적인 그런 자세가 아닐까 합니다. 현실을 어떻게 바라볼 것인가? 제가 그 기후변화 문제 앞서 말씀드렸듯이 전문가는 아니지만 관심을 갖고 쭉 이렇게 봐온 제 나름대로의 결론은 이미 물론 여전히 그 과학 scientific community 내에서 과학계 공동체 내에서 어떤 이견이 있고 어떤 그 논쟁이 있는 건 사실이지만 앞서 말씀드렸듯이 상당히 그 과거에 우리가 생각을 했던 과학자들이 생각했던 것보다는 그런 재앙의 가능성이 훨씬 빨리 다가오고 있다. 그 총체적인 어떤 그 재앙의 가능성이 언제 올 것이냐 이거를 저는 많이 그 과학자들이 논쟁하는 것을 봤습니다만 이 사실들이 좀 더 우리 사회에 또 교육기관에 많이 알려졌으면 합니다. 근데 그것이 어느 것이 정답이다라는 얘기는 제 자신 그런 판단을 내릴 그런 역량이 안 되고요. 또 아마 많은 분들이 비전공자들이 또는 심지어는 전공자들 간에도 이미 여전히 그런 이견이 있을 거라고 생각합니다. 그러나 교육을 받는 우리 학생들이 스스로 생각할 수 있고 또 대학에서는 연구를 진행하니까 그 연구 성과들을 좀 더 사회에 알리고 그래서 시민들이 판단하게 하는 상황이 매우 중요하지 않겠나. 판단은 뭐 아무리 예를 들면 천재과학자가 얘기해도 틀릴 수는 있는 문제이지만 과학 커뮤니티 내에서 컨센서스로 만들어지고 있는 부분을 우리는 믿을 수밖에 없고 우리가 병이 걸리면 의사를 찾아가서 진단 결과를 보고 환자가 믿듯이 지금은 우리가 기후변화에 대처할 수 있는 가장 중요한 수단이고 도구입니다. 그러면 과학 커뮤니티 내에서의 어떤 그런 컨센서스를 믿고 또 앞선 연구, 또 권위 있는 연구, 최신의 연구를 우리가 계속 팔로우해 가면서 우리 개인 스스로 정치권이 결정을 내줄 거다라는 믿음은 그렇게 됐으면 가장 좋겠지만 지난 한 반세기 넘게의 기후변화의 역사의 흐름이 우리한테 아주 옹변으로 말해주듯이 그런 세월이 참 꼭 조만간 왔으면 좋겠는데 결과는 잘 모르겠습니다. 그래서 일단은 우리 교육기관이 또 우리 연구를 선도하시는 우리 교수님들이 이 문제는 물론 과학의 문제이지만 사회과학의 문제이고 또 인문학의 문제입니다. 이 전체의 지구 행성의 어떤 그 하드 데이터를 놓고 이것이 얼마나 심각하느냐 하는 부분은 분명히 과학의 문제이지만 그 다음에 시민 개개인이 그 과학에서 나오는 그런 컨센서스나 또는 선행 연구나 또는 중요한 그런 발견들을 내가 어떻게 소화해낼 거냐 하는 것은 우리 사람들의 마음이고 의식의 문제입니다. 그래서 이 부분은 우리가 좀 소홀히 해왔던 인문학 분야에서도 매우 적극적으로 이런 논의를 진행해 나가면서 교육기관의 책임을 다해 나가는 것이 미래 세대를 위한 길이다. 예를 들면 부모가 자식을 사랑한다, 또는 어른들이 젊은 세대가 미래의 주역이다라는 얘기를 하지만 사랑과 어떤 그 주역이라고 말할 때 그게 도대체 무슨 말이냐? 학자들과 과학계에서는 지금 굉장히 실전적 위협이고 이것이 불과 수년 또는 10년 또는 몇십 년 더일 수도 있겠죠. 그런 굉장히 그 험한 이야기가 오고 가는 이 세상에서 무엇이 사랑이고 어떤 무엇이 미래 세대에 관한 희망이고 또 어른들과 교육기관이 무엇을 할 것인가, 이거는 깊이 우리 교육기관이 생각을 해야 되지 않을까 하는 생각을 합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Cho. I think you wrapped up in a very inspiring and compelling manner our discussion right now about the responsibilities of the academic institutions, the need for literacy, climate literacy that is so much in demand, and the role of the scientific community. And to some extent, I think indeed, and I would like to congratulate you that Kyunhee University is taking up this leadership with a sense of responsibility, and kind of your university goes back to why universities in principle exist and why they were starting, because the birth of universities was to respond to societal needs, and nowadays the need of the society, the global society, is indeed to respond to climate change. So leadership and responsibility, this is indeed what Kyunhee University has been testified to us, and I would like to congratulate, to thank the panelists and to thank the public for this discussion.
네, 장시간 동안 수고해 주신 좌장 역할을 맡아주신 북구바 사무총장님 감사드리고 또 패널리스트 여러분께도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 저희가 좀 바로 끝내기 아쉬운 마음이 있어서요. 몇 가지 질문을 좀 받도록 하겠습니다. 혹시 우리 패널리스트 분들께 질문 있으신 분들은 지금 이 시간 질문해 주시기 바랍니다. 네. 마이크를 좀 전달해 주시기 바랍니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 저는 유네스코 아태무용유산센터에서 연구정보 실장을 맡고 있는 김덕순이라고 합니다. 사실 제가 이제 석사 논문을 준비할 때 이제 지속 가능 발전, 지속 가능 개발이라는 주제를 한 30년 전에 들었는데요. 지금도 여전히 그런 개념의 논의가 진행되고 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 특히 환경 분야에서 기후 변화 협약 분야에 있어서 오늘 말씀해 주신 걸 많이 들었는데요. 제가 여러분 패널들의 의견을 들으면서 궁금했던 점이 하나가 있습니다. 다른 건 아니고 일단 여러 가지 기후 변화에 대한 문제점 인식들은 각 국가들이 공유하고 해결해 나가려고 노력을 하는데, 함에도 불구하고 미국 등이 이제 기후 변화 협약을 탈퇴하는 등의 여러 가지 이제 국제적인 공조가 잘 이루어지지 않는 현실이 되고 있는데요. 그런 와중에 있어서 아까 그 피터 와담스 교수님께서 말씀하셨듯이 시민들의 어떤 인식이라든가 의지가 그러한 어떤 정치적인 쪽으로 영향을 미쳐야 된다고 생각을 하는데, 아까 말씀하셨듯이 교육 분야는 그 해답으로서 굉장히 롱텀적인 장기적인 시각에서 접근한다고 하셨는데, 그러면 이 짧은 단기 기간 안에서 시민 의식, 기후 변화를 해결하기 위한 시민의 의식을 깨울 수 있는 그런 방법들이라든가 그런 것들에 대해서도 한번 의견을 주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 특히 그 미디어의 역할이라든가 아니면은 세계의 어떤 오피니언 리더들의 기후에 대한 인식에 대한 어떤 그런 전 세계적인 어떤 홍보라든가 그런 미디어 역할을 통해서 시민 의식이 좀 더 깨어나고 올바른 정보를 받고 해서 기후 변화에 대한 시민들의 어떤 관심이 높아져서 정치적인 어떤 그런 정치를 하는 정치가들에게 대해서 영향력을 행사해서 기후 변화 문제를 해결할 수 있는 방안도 있지 않을까 하는 생각이 드는데요. 이런 부분에 대해서 좀 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
이사장님께서 조금 답을 해주시겠습니까? 네.
상당히 시간이 간 것 같은데요. 그 조금 전에 반기문 총장님께서 재직하실 때 어느 자리에서 이런 이야기를 들었습니다. 우리 일간지를 펼치면 그 탑 뉴스 기사들이 이제 실리는데 우리나라는 좀 지나치게 좀 정치적인 국내적인 사안에 많이 너무 지면을 할애하는 거 아니냐 하는 그런 얘기를 제가 얼핏 제 기억이 맞는지 모르겠습니다만 기억을 하고 있습니다. 저도 평소에 비슷한 생각을 해왔습니다. 근데 사실 우리가 얘기하는 기후변화 환경 문제는 말 그대로 좀 멀리 떨어져 있는 내 일상과 떨어져 있고 내 삶과 떨어져 있고 내 이웃과 떨어져 있는 문제로 인식하는데 사실상 그렇지 않다라는 것은 너무도 우리가 이제 잘 알게 됐고 이거는 다른 얘기입니다만 메르스 사태를 우리가 겪은 후에 해외에서 일어나는 여러 일들이 어떻게 순식간에 우리 나라에 영향을 미치느냐 하는 것은 굉장히 체험적으로 느끼고 있습니다. 기후변화가 이제 그중 하나인 것 같고요. 사실 여러 가지 우리 스스로가 쌓아온 자랑스러운 역사도 있지만 좀 그 자랑스러움을 넘어서야 하는 문제가 뭘지라고 하는 부분은 이게 국가와 정치와 정당의 문제는 아니라고 생각합니다. 그건 일반 시민들이 그 문제를 어떻게 생각하느냐 하는 개별적인 삶의 철학의 문제라고 저는 생각이 됩니다. 그럴 때만이 그런 우리 사회에서 어찌 보면 좀 철학적인 논쟁을 금기시되어 있다라고 표현을 해도 좋을 만큼 매우 척박한 상황입니다. 먹고 살기 바쁜데 언제 그런 고상한 얘기하고 있냐 이런 얘기를 주변에서 많이 하고 심지어는 교수 사회에서까지 이런 얘기를 많이 안 하는 것이 우리 학계의 현실이 아닌가 하는 생각이 듭니다. 근데 이 부분은 물론 먹고 사는 것도 중요하고 지식도 중요하고 연구도 중요하지만 무엇을 위한 무엇이냐라고 하는 부분이 참 중요한 시대고 그리고 이제는 초연결의 시대라고 하는데 그게 꼭 인터넷뿐만은 아니라 어떤 사물 인터넷 무슨 인터넷 어떤 정보 이런 문제 물론 초연결 사회이지만 어떤 과학이 발견한 위대한 발견은 우리가 이 대자연과 얼마나 촘촘히 엮여 있는가, 이웃 나라와 이웃 사회에 얼마나 촘촘히 엮여 있는가, 또 인간과 생명권이 어떻게 촘촘히 연결되어 있는가, 이런 과학적인 발견들이 너무 많이 또 있고 또 이런 것이 우리 교육 속에 녹아들어야 되고 또 우리가 좀 더 바라건대는 언론 쪽에서 좀 더 이런 문제를 많이 부각시켜서 어떤 생존에 필요한 것이 과거에 경제에만 국한이 됐다면 이제는 경제만 가지고서는 아까 우리 던럽 선생님께서 굉장히 아주 요약적으로 잘 저희한테 렉처를 해주셨지만 재앙이 임박해 있을 수 있는 그 가능성에 관한 부분이 우리 모두의 생존이다. 우리 어떤 좁은 의미의 커뮤니티뿐만 아니라 지구 인류사회 전체의 문제다라고 하는 관점에서 우리가 개인 스스로가 제 바람은 철학이 대단한 건 아니겠죠. 그러니까 삶을 생각하고 나와 자연, 사회, 세계와의 연관을 생각하면서 내 스스로의 생각을 정리하는 것은 교과서의 몫이 아니고 내 삶의 문제다라고 하는 쪽의 그런 사회적인 트렌드가 만들어졌으면 하는 그런 바람입니다.
네, 우리 두 번째 질문은 지금 일본에서 그 요코하마 대학교에서 요코이 부총장님께서 저희 지금 함께 자리하고 계신데요. 꼭 좀 질문을 하시겠다고 청을 해주셨습니다. 요코하마 부총장님 질문해 주시기 부탁드리겠습니다. 마이크 좀 전달해 주세요.
I'm Yoko from Okayama University from Japan, and also I work for UNESCO as UNESCO chairholder in education for sustainable development. Well, first of all, I really would like to appreciate this great opportunity, and I'm very much honored to be here to experience such a great moment for peace and peace education. And just I'd like to share with my ideas, and also I'd like to respond to a question, how to expand more voice from, of course, future generations and also from universities. But in fact, Okayama University, please allow me to introduce my university and Okayama region. And Okayama is one of the oldest and one of the most popular destinations for education for sustainable development since 2005. And Kyung University, definitely one of the most popular destinations for peace education and global citizenship education. So in other words, in this East Asian region, we have two most popular destinations for peace education, citizenship education, and education for sustainable development. And thanks to UNESCO, when you were Secretary General, Okayama is really was becoming more and more popular destination for anyone to advance education for sustainable development. So my idea is really how to integrate between such a strategic movement among global citizenship education and education for sustainable development, ESD, and let's say Earth Charter from Costa Rica. Actually, Okayama is very first sister city of Costa Rica. Already 50 years has passed. So maybe Costa Rica and Okayama, let's say Kyunhee, three destinations are really important for peace education and education for sustainable development, including Earth Charter movement. Actually, Earth Charter movement, next year, 2020, will celebrate 20 years anniversary. So in other words, we can integrate between three strategic movement and integrate the three most popular destinations from Costa Rica, from Kyunhee University and Okayama, to involve, of course, future generations and also leading university institutions to face such a kind of global, crisis and also, front of the earth. So that's my idea. Just I'd like to share such a kind of concrete, strategic movement from Kyunhee University, including Okayama and Costa Rica, which is
Thank you very much.
definitely this is region.
Yes. Just the comments. Yes. Thank you very much. 혹시 다른 질문 있으신가요? 예, 우리 international students maybe?
Hello, I am Iman. I came all the way from Morocco to do an MBA here in South Korea, in Kyunghee University. I've listened really well to the discussion. I feel really grateful to be here and for being able to share also my opinion here. As you said, I am part of the youth, and I am very scared of what's coming. I don't know how we're gonna be dealing with it, as I feel like I am weak. I feel like I can't do much for my planet. I am not a scientist, but I want to do a lot for my planet. You said that you are going to be contacting international organizations to kind of gather scientists and to build a budget so that we can all save our planet Earth. Are there any concrete movements towards that? Do you have any list of international organizations, or is it still an idea, a theory to be developed? And thank you.
Well, it's still largely an idea, but I think it's an idea that has to be implemented. And I appreciate when you say you're scared about the future, because many people of your age are in the same state, and I can understand it because you're young, you've been educated to understand what's going on and to realise what an emergency we're in, whereas older people, in theory, understand the problem, but it doesn't affect them quite in the same way. They feel, they first of all feel, well, we've had most of our lives, so if things go bad, it doesn't matter too much. Whereas when you're starting your life, it's a very important thing. And there's, for instance, when I lecture to students and end up talking about the terrible things that are happening and going to happen, and my students end up saying, well, why are you looking so happy at the end? Because I generally try and end on an upbeat note. And cynically, I sometimes say it's because I don't have to live through all these things, but you do. So age is really important here, because you've got your life in front of you, and that life is going to be lived in a world that's really going bad in every way, but especially in terms of climate and all the terrible things that climate change is bringing us. So yes, there has to be something done quickly to respond to the urgency that young people feel and the despair that they feel, which they shouldn't be feeling at the outset of their lives. But bringing about bringing about an international body that has enough clout and enough money to actually get things done, that has to be done by the older people, the ones who can command funds, but they haven't done it yet. And I agree with you, something that wouldn't be a big urgency should be that we look to how do we assemble organisations and funds that are commensurate with the magnitude of the task that we have to do rapidly. That's something we haven't properly addressed, I guess even at this meeting, and it's probably the thing we should address most urgently.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Wadhams, and then Dr. Ian Dunlop wants to make a comment also, please.
If I could just address the point, and also the question that the gentleman in the front here also raised earlier. What do we do? I mean, we've had, I think at the end of any conference, we've had a good conference. The question always is, what do you do tomorrow morning? Don't forget about what we've talked. And I think at the moment for academia, there's an enormous opportunity to take some very concrete action, because if you look around the world, tomorrow in most of the Western countries, school children are on strike. All of tomorrow because of climate, demanding action from governments. You have organisations developing that are taking civil disobedience action, groups like the Extinction Rebellion, which started in Britain and is now spread around the world, demanding, they're shutting cities down, saying, look, this is not good enough. We now need absolute concrete action from politicians. And it's not just declaring emergencies, it's actually taking action beyond that. I mentioned earlier that the increasing concern around the world is that the economic model we currently have is not working, and it can't continue. We're going to have to rethink the entire thing. The Business Roundtable in the United States 2 weeks ago came out with the view that we now have to rethink that model. The Financial Times in London yesterday started a discussion on the same thing. What is that model going to look like? Now, I would have thought for academics in a university like this, you have an ideal opportunity to now start writing to your media, to your newspapers, with either questions or articles saying, look, the same thing, this model isn't working, these are the facts, we have a climate crisis, we have to start a different discussion. You can bring in the emergency aspects of all of this, and you can build movements, as is now happening in the Western countries, around civic action, which is absolutely concrete. I mean, the effect of school children strikes has been quite dramatic in Australia, for example, in confronting older people with the fact they now have to take action. And it's the same in Europe and the same in, I think, increasingly in the US. So the opportunity is there for the same sort of thing to happen in this country. I hesitate to start promoting revolution, but that's what we need. But, you know, if it's done a constructive way, then why not? And I think that is an absolutely, to me, valid activity for a university to pick up on.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful response. And maybe we take a couple of more questions. Yes, please go ahead. 미안해요. 우리 학생한테 주고 마지막으로 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네.
네, 오늘 좋은 말씀해 주셔서 감사하고 우선 저는 그 서울대학교 환경대학원에서 환경 정책을 공부하는 학생입니다. 네, 저는 일단 제 질문이자 제안의 세 꼭지가 있는데 일단 두 가지는 이 행사 주최 측에 약간 드리고 싶은 말씀은 지금 에어컨이 가동 중이라고 들었는데 되게 대다수의 분들이 긴 소매의 옷을 착용하고 계시고 유난히 제 자리가 더 추운 것 같기도 하고 그래요. 그래서 그리고 두 번째는 지금 해외에서 연사분들이 오셨는데 직접 오시는데 이제 에너지가 또 많이 들잖아요. 근데 아직까지는 우리가 탄소 기반의 그 에너지를 많이 사용하고 있기 때문에 혹시 지금 우리가 당장 대안을 실천해야 하는 시점에서 혹시 그러니까 그 기후 위기는 이제 문화의 전반적인 변화랑도 굉장히 밀접하게 관련이 있으니까 우리가 지금까지 익숙하게 받아들여 왔던 이런 문화들을 좀 바꿔가는 그런 거를 체험하는 장이 될 수도 있지 않았을까 약간 이런 아쉬움이 있고 뭐 화상회의라든가 이런 기술들이 있어서 세 번째는 조인원 선생님께 드리고 싶은 말씀은 굉장히 시급한 걸 개인적으로도 자각하고 계시는 것 같아요. 근데 바로 직접적으로 말씀드리면 교수님들 간의 그런 시국 선언이라던가 이런 걸 주도해 주실 생각이 혹시 계신지 약간 들으면서 그런 생각이 들었어요. 왜냐하면 국내 정치가 시급할 때는 그렇게 나서시지만 국제적으로 심각한 상황인데 국내 정부 대응이 미온한 상황은 약간 시국 선언 정도가 필요한 게 아닐까 이런 생각이 들었습니다. 감사합니다.
어려운 과제를 지금 제안을 하셨는데요. 우리 이사장님 적절하게 판단해서 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
좋은 제안 충고 감사드립니다. 근데 제가 있는 지금 근무하는 데는 학사 개입을 금하게 돼 있어요. 대학에. 그래서 우리 총장님께 한번 다시 여쭤봐야 할 것 같고요. 다 맞는 말씀인 것 같습니다. 그리고 아마 이번에 지금 유엔 총회가 진행 중인데 이제 글로벌 클라이밋 서밋 굉장히 저도 많이 기대를 하고 있고 어떤 결과가 나올지 그리고 또 아마 전 세계 많은 대학들이 거기 클라이밋 서밋 참여도 하지만 또 아마 별도의 대학 간의 그런 행사가 있는 모양입니다. 그런 부분을 좀 많이 노력을 해야 될 것 같고요. 그 다음에 이제 아마 여기 지금 가동 중 나도 좀 코가 자꾸 막히는데 좀 껐으면 좋겠고 이런 것 같습니다. 우리가 일상에서 바꿔야 할 일들이 굉장히 많지 않습니까? 지금 아마 현재 산업화 이후에 1850년을 기준으로 하면은 1.1도 올라왔지만 사실 산업혁명이 1850년에 시작된 건 아니니까 1750년 또는 조금 전으로 생각하면 1.75도인가요? 1.8도인가 이렇게 올라왔다고 그래요. 그럼 거의 사실은 그 이전 시기에 비해서 2도씨 가까이 접근을 한 건데 이제 이 위기의식 자체를 이제 공유를 못하고 있는 부분이 참 안타깝고 또 하나는 물론 개인적인 노력이 굉장히 중요합니다. 엄청나게 중요한데 사실 저는 개인적으로 그보다 더 중요한 거는 어떤 뭐 국제 간 협약을 통하든 뭐를 통하든 정부의 정책이 대대적으로 바뀌지 않으면 차를 타고 다니는데 차 타고 다니지 마십시오라고 했을 때 성공을 거둘 확률은 굉장히 적다. 그 다음에 그 시민들, 그런 시민들을 우리가 질타의 대상으로 봐야 할 것이냐, 저는 그렇게 생각 안 합니다. 그러니까 에너지 구조를 바꿔서 수소차가 나온 지 전기차가 나온 지 벌써 몇십 년이 됐는데 그게 안 되는 사회 구조에 관한 관심을 우리가 더 가져야 되지 않느냐. 그리고 그 다이어트 방법도 역시 마찬가지로 저도 깜짝 놀랐는데 그 우리 지구상에 척추동물과 포유동물, 인간을 합쳐서 또 야생동물까지 그 척추동물, 포유동물의 인간과 관련된 동물이 95%라고 합니다. 그 엄청난 양이죠. 인간이 섭생에 필요한 식문화를 즐기기 위한 또는 인구의 어떤 폭증 상태로 인해서 지금 78억의 인구, 그것도 대부분이 좀 어려운 나라들에서는 그런 섭생을 못 누리겠죠. 비교적 잘 사는 나라 그 이상에서 그런 우리 식생활에 필요한 즐기는 문화 또는 물론 생존도 있지만 그로부터 비롯되는 엄청난 양의 메탄가스를 생각을 한다면 사실 섭생도 많이 바꿔야 하는데 또 모든 시민들께 그거를 강요할 수는 없는 것이고 빨리 그 대체의 그 어떤 가능성을 정부와 사회 차원에서 빨리 만들어내는 것이 참 중요하지 않을까. 저도 그 그레타 툰베리 양을 이제 그 요트를 타고 가는 그거를 쭉 소식을 접하고 근데 참 너무도 안타까운 상황입니다. 그 부분이. 그래서 제 생각에는 그런 우리 사회 구조뿐만 아니라 세계의 산업 구조, 산업 문명의 구조 자체가 빨리 재생 쪽으로 넘어가서 시민들이 이런 위기 의식도 좀 덜 느끼고 또 그런 또 향유를 할 삶은 또 있어야 하니까 그것이 같이 병행될 수 있는 그런 노력을 매우 빠른 시간 내에 대학은 대학의 역할을 하면서 또는 이 다른 뭐 유치원부터 고등학교까지 또 역할을 찾아야 하겠고요. 그 다음에 좀 더 중요하게는 우리 언론에서 언론기관에서 이런 이슈들을 어떤 잘잘못을 가리기 시작하거나 특정 어떤 그룹을 질타하기 시작하면 혁신하기가 참 어려워집니다. 개선하기가 참 어려워집니다. 다 과거에 잘 몰랐던 어떤 삶의 방식을 좀 하나의 그 역사의 대세로 만들어가는 과정을 최대한 줄일 수 있는 노력을 정치인뿐만 아니라 기업이나 언론, 대학에서 또는 시민사회에서 함께 만들어가야 되지 않을까 하는 생각을 합니다.
네, 중요한 말씀 감사드리고요. 우리 학생 아까부터 손 들었는데 질문하시고 누구한테 질문하실지도 밝혀주시기 바랍니다.
안녕하세요. 저는 경기도 모 고등학교에 재학 중인 고등학교 3학년 장준혁이라고 합니다. 다름이 아니라 오늘은 목요일입니다. 저는 이 시간대쯤이면 학교에 가서 학교 수업을 듣고 발표를 하고 친구들과 같이 어울러 있을 시간입니다. 하지만 제가 오늘 이 자리에 나온 이유는 따로 있습니다. 저는 늘 토론자분께서 늘 말씀하셨다시피 저는 미래 세대이자 미래 세대를 살아갈 사람입니다. 시민이기도 하고요. 저는 늘 고등학교 생활을 해오면서 국어, 영어, 수학, 과학, 사회 과목 등을 늘 배우면서 늘 단순화된 그런 교육 과정을 들으면서 늘 배워왔습니다. 하지만 저는 지금 이 미래 세대에게 필요한 이런 교육은 아까 전에 피터 워담스 교수님께서 말씀하셨다시피 기후변화에 대한 교육 또는 우리 환경에 대한 교육 전 지구적인 이런 안건에 대해서 생각해 볼 수 있는 그런 교육의 장이 필요하다고 생각합니다. 그래서 저는 실제로 경희대학교 후마니타스 칼리지에서 실시하고 있는 세계 시민 교육에 대해 큰 인상을 받았는데요. 실제로 대학에 들어가서 이런 세계 시민 교육을 실시하는 것보다 미래 세대에 나아갈 인재이자 세계 시민인 고등학생들을 대상으로도 이런 후마니타스 칼리지의 세계 시민 교육을 따서 따로 어릴 때부터 천천히 이런 세계 시민의 기반을 갖추면서 나아가는 것이 지금 현재 우리나라 대한민국 교육이 나아가야 할 나침반이라고 생각합니다. 그래서 조인원 이사장님께 질문 드리겠습니다. 지금 대학교에서 이런 교육을 실시하는 것보다 고등학교, 중학교 또는 더 내려간다면 초등학교 이런 학생들까지 모두 어우를 수 있는 각자 세계 시민으로 성장할 수 있는 역량을 키워주는 그런 교육 기반을 갖춘 교육이 우리나라에게 현재 필요한 시점이라고 생각합니다. 혹시 이에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 질문 드리고 싶습니다.
질문 고맙습니다. 그 주제를 사실은 예전에는 이제 대학에 쭉 공부를 했기 때문에 이렇게 깊이 생각을 안 했고요, 또 안 하려고 노력을 했고, 말씀하신 내용은 뭐 전적으로 공감을 합니다. 그래서 이제 그것이 조금 전에 말씀해주신 이유가 경희대학이 이제 후마니타스 칼리지를 설립한 이유고요. 그 다음에 그것을 가급적이면 좀 개방했으면 좋겠다라는 생각도 하고, 또 동시에는 우리 경희사이버대학이 있습니다. 온라인 대학인데요. 좀 그 교육 과정을 좀 탄탄하게 만들어서 어떤 그 프로그램을 개방해서 경희대학교 학생 또는 사이버대학 학생뿐만이 아니라 일반 초, 중, 고등학교에서도 강의를 들을 수 있는 그런 프로그램을 좀 다변화했으면 좋겠다, 이렇게 지금 생각을 하고 있고 구상을 시작을 했습니다. 근데 제일 중요한 문제는 그건 아마 경희대학, 경희사이버대학뿐만 아니라 다른 대학에서도 비슷한 생각을 할 가능성이 있는데요. 상당한 걸림돌이 있습니다. 그리고 또 고민거리가 우리 사회에 오랫동안 구조화되어 있는 입시 제도의 문제와 이것이 연결이 되어 있습니다. 그러니까 벌써 초등학교, 중고등학교 되면은 대학 진학을 생각하고, 대학에 들어와서는 또 취직 그 시험 준비를 하고, 이런 시험의 연속인 이런 그 어떤 그 입시 제도와 사회 진출의 그 구조에 관해서 이 큰 틀에 관한 좀 공론화 작업이 좀 크게 있었으면 좋겠다. 이 어떤 시험 보는 기계로 우리 청소년들을 만든다면 매우 슬픈 일이고, 개인적으로도 그렇고 사회적으로도 그렇고 국가를 위해서 그렇고 또 세계를 위해서 그렇고, 우리나라의 문제는 이제 더 이상 우리나라 문제만이 아니니까 우리나라가 미치는 세계적인 영향력도 크고 작은 의미에서 굉장히 많이 열려 있습니다. 그래서 이 부분을 함께 풀어가서, 예를 들면 아마 그런 프로그램이 개설된다고 하더라도 지금 여지껏 입시 위주로 짜여져 있는 교과 과목을 초, 중고등학교에서는 어떻게 바꿀 것이냐, 이 문제하고 직결이 되어 있고, 또 학부모님들의 기대, 또 우리 사회 최근에 사회적인 이슈가 되고 있는 몇몇 사람뿐만이 아니라 우리 사회 전반적으로 학부모님들이 가지고 있는 그런 기대는, 교육기관에 대한 기대는 대학에 들어가고 또 좋은 대학에 들어가고 이런 쪽에 맞춰져 있는 사회 문화가 함께 동시에 변화해야 하기 때문에 저희가 어떤 할 수 있는 일은 그런 좋은 온라인 프로그램들을 개설해서 굳이 오지 않고도 청소년들이 택할 수 있는, 뭐 택하기보다는 교과 외 과정으로 어떤 그런 교육에 접할 수 있는 이런 가능성을, 또 길을 열려고 준비를 하고 있는 중입니다.
네, 감사합니다. 아마 또 마지막 질문 하나만 더 하고, 우리 학생들이 너무 진지하게 참여를 해서요, 언제까지 진행을 해야 될지 모르겠는데 일단 우리 여학생 한번 질문을 기회를 드리도록 하겠습니다.
Hello, I'm a student from Hanguk Academy of Foreign Studies, and I'm 17 years old. And it's an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you guys. And I wanted to ask you about, as we are the future generation, we take the responsibility for the future of the Earth, and we have to know about how the climate change is serious right now. So, but however, many of the young and future generations in the world do not know how serious the situation and the climate change situation is. So even though they are getting education about how serious the climate change is, the younger and the future generations do not really know about how serious it is. So by looking at this situation, I thought education is not a fast and an efficient way to inform about the climate changes. So therefore, I wanted to ask if there are any other ways to inform about the seriousness of the climate change to the future generations. Thank you.
누구한테 질문하시는 거죠?
Everyone.
Everyone.
다
Would
괜찮아요.
you like to maybe Ian Dunlap, Dr. Ian Dunlap, please respond.
Yeah, thank you for the question, a very good question. Yeah, you're right. I mean, education as we normally know it is going to take too long. So somehow you have to cut through that. And I would suggest that one of the ways that you could be doing it at the moment is to make contact with the activities that are going on in other countries, where school children particularly are standing up and saying, listen, this is not good enough. We need our leaders to be doing much more. Which is what is happening tomorrow in many countries in the Western world. But there is a lot of material available on websites and so on the reasons why they're doing this, not just the fact they're doing it. And the reasons why, although the process under which they're trying to get politicians to take a different position. So I think one way is certainly to lock into, make contact with that sort of material, look at it, see what makes sense in a Korean context, and try and pick up on some of the initiatives that are already happening to get over the problem you've raised, which we have to move on this much more quickly.
Yes, Hero Adams, you make comments, and then Madame Bokova next.
Perhaps I could add, in answer to your question and to the previous question, about learning at school, and I think it's very vital that there should be education at the school level on climate change. But if you're going to have courses at school, you have to have good teachers, and then you have to have good teachers to teach those teachers. So you need, that's where I think a university is very important, to teach the teachers who are going to teach in the school. I think that this question of speed, it can be covered in school levels, because at school you actually learn much faster than you do later in life, because the courses starting from scratch take you to a level of knowledge that's significant more quickly if at the school level, and I can remember that at school, that I learned more quickly than I did at university, and I learned quicker at university than I did in later life, and I don't learn anything now. So it's a progression downwards in speed of learning, and you're the fastest. So I think school levels is important, as long as the teachers are good and know how to do it. But I agree, you can shortcut by going to the wide range of sort of media facilities available, but there you need to choose the ones or be shown the ones that are actually valid, and there's some that aren't. I mean, on the web, you're always in danger of running across presentations that are off the wall, or that is invalid. So there's a danger there. And the other question that you asked is if you look at which countries do this best, you look at some countries, for instance, many parts of the United States, children don't learn anything about climate change because first of all, the official policy of the president is that there isn't any climate change, but that also applies to the school systems in some of the states, especially southern states of the US. A child could come through that system and come out as a student absolutely ignorant about climate change. And I simply don't know how you get around that except a revolution, because if you prevent people from learning, then that's probably the worst thing you can possibly do. And it's happening in a lot of parts of the world now, including advanced countries like the US.
Thank you very much, Pierre Adams. Please, Madame Bokova.
I would like to add also to this debate that education for climate and sustainable development is not entirely a new concept. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals carefully, because through UNESCO we were leading the goal number 4 on education, and there you have a specific target, which is also education for sustainable development, including education for climate. So it is there as a goal for governments, for civil society, for everybody. And vice versa. If you look at the goal number 13 on climate, there is also education there. So it is there, it is very important, and of course, it may be complex, it's not easy, but it covers teachers, it covers curricular, everything. Of course, education for sustainable development globally is not either a new concept. We have had a decade. We finished it in Japan, in Aichi, Nagoya in 2014. We had plan of action. We moved also with some. Now the time is that this is implemented by governments. You have to include it into the education systems. I think this is critical. And this is where the demand, I would say, to push the governments to do this is critically important. It exists. It's not something new. It just has to be implemented with the right, I would say, with the big responsibility and approach. There are countries which are doing it, which are more, I would say, cognizant of this. I would say, and I'm mentioning Japan, because I think Japan was one of the pioneers into this, the disaster risk prevention and everything that was there. And we established at UNESCO Japan Prize on Education for Sustainable Development, rewarding such projects and educational institutions which are very much looking forward to it. Just want to say that it is there, it exists, we just have to embrace it, take it, and hold the governments accountable. I think this is your role also, and the role of the civil society. The role of the civil society is to hold governments accountable, whether they implement something that they have agreed to. Because Sustainable Development Goal and Paris Agreement, they have been adopting these governments. They have committed, and now they have to implement it.
Yes, thank you very much. 이사장님 조금 중첩이 되지만 코멘트 하시겠어요? 괜찮으세요? 네. 그럼 마지막 질문을 받고 좀 종료하도록. 시간이 너무 많아서 마지막 질문 하나만 하겠습니다. 우리 남학생, 예, 뒤에 계신 분. 예, 우리 고등학생 했으니까 대학생 한번 기회를 드리도록 하겠습니다. 마지막 질문하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 간단하게.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 경희대학교 정치외교학과에 재학 중인 박기병이라고 합니다. 바로 질문을 드리면 저는 현재 경희대학교 후마니타스 칼리지에서 세계화 시민을 훈령하신 정우탁 교수님과 함께 공부하고 있는데요. 앞서 말씀드린 어떤 기후 위기와 관련된 어떤 인류의 다양한 문제들을 해결할 시민으로서 거듭날 경희대학교 학생들에게 학생들이 갖춰야 될 어떤 덕목이나 가치가 있다면 어떤 것이 있을지 한번 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
누구한테 질문해?
그래서 이리나 보코바 교수님께 질문드리고 싶습니다.
Yeah, Madame Bokova, if this question goes to you, please.
Well, it's naturally come from the other, and I see Mr. Chang smiling on the other side, because I should have mentioned also this aspect of education. Now we speak about global citizenship education, a totally different new concept that we have launched, which embraces exactly this approach. It is about climate, it is about global responsibilities, it is about what kind of citizens, active citizens with position, with values, should come from school, because education is not transmitting of information, right? I think Professor Widom knows very well this. You can find anywhere the information. It's about critical thinking. It's about assessing. It's about civil engagement. You're asking us what to do when you confront the challenges. It's about exactly being a citizen, a global citizen, global citizen with responsibilities also towards the others, because climate change, as we said, it does not hit borders, geographical, political borders. It is about all of us. And this type of education, and I would like to commend once again Kyunhee University, because already Kyunhee University has embraced global citizenship education. Like I would say, Korea is one of the biggest supporter and proponent of global citizenship education, and Kyunhee already has such kind of courses, and I think this is very important.
대단히 감사합니다. 이것으로 우리가 그 세계 평화의 날 그 피스바 페스티벌 기념 원탁 회의를 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 끝까지 자리해 주신 여러분 대단히 감사합니다.